Have you ever stood in a white dress, surrounded by everyone you love, only to watch your entire world crumble in a single sentence? Have you ever felt your heart physically break inside your chest while 100 pairs of eyes watched you fall apart? Let me tell you something that will shake you to your core. Something so unbelievable that even now, months later, I still wake up some mornings thinking it was all just a nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was my wedding day, and the man I loved more than life itself ended it all right there at the altar. And what I discovered afterward about his real intentions would haunt me in ways I never imagined possible. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I survived the most devastating betrayal of my life, only to uncover a truth so dark and calculated that it changed everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and the person I had chosen to spend forever with. This isn't just a story about a wedding that didn't happen. This is a story about manipulation, deception, and a plan so twisted that when I finally uncovered it, I couldn't believe someone I had shared my bed with, someone I had trusted with my deepest fears and dreams, could be capable of such cruelty. But before I tell you what he was really planning to do, before I reveal the shocking truth that nearly destroyed me completely, I need to take you back to the beginning, to the moment I first met Daniel Thompson. Because understanding how we got to that altar, how I ended up standing there in front of everyone I loved while he shattered me into a million pieces, that's the only way you'll truly understand the magnitude of what he did and why his plan was so devastatingly effective. I was 26 when I met Daniel at a mutual friend's art gallery opening in downtown Chicago. It was one of those crisp October evenings where the air smells like fallen leaves and possibility. And I remember wearing this emerald green dress that made me feel confident and beautiful. I wasn't looking for love that night. Actually, I had just gotten out of a relationship 3 months prior and was perfectly content being single, focusing on my career as a pediatric nurse and spending time with my close-knit group of friends. But then I saw him across the gallery, standing in front of a massive abstract painting, and something inside me shifted. He had this presence about him, confident but not arrogant, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that suggested success without screaming it. His dark hair was slightly tousled, like he'd run his fingers through it while deep in thought, and when he turned and our eyes met, I felt this electric jolt run through my entire body. I know it sounds cliché, like something out of a romance novel, but I swear to you, in that moment, time actually seemed to slow down. He smiled at me, this genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes, and I found myself smiling back before I could even think about it. Within minutes, he had crossed the gallery and introduced himself. His voice was deep and smooth, the kind of voice that makes you want to lean in closer just to hear it better. We talked for 3 hours straight that night, completely oblivious to everyone else around us. He told me he was a financial consultant, that he'd moved to Chicago from Boston 2 years ago for work, that he loved hiking and cooking and old jazz music. He asked me questions about my work, and not the superficial kind that people ask just to be polite. He genuinely wanted to know what made me choose pediatric nursing, what my hardest day had been like, what moment had made me absolutely certain this was my calling. I told him about little Emma, a 6-year-old cancer patient I'd cared for who had passed away in my arms, and how even though it had broken my heart, holding her while she slipped away peacefully had been the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. And Daniel, he didn't just nod sympathetically like most people do. He reached out and gently touched my hand, and I saw real emotion in his eyes, real empathy and understanding. That night, as he walked me to my car, he asked if he could see me again, and I said yes, without hesitation. Our first official date was the following weekend at this intimate Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park. Daniel showed up with a single white rose, which he said reminded him of purity and new beginnings. We sat in a corner booth, sharing calamari and talking about our childhoods, our dreams, our fears. He told me his parents had divorced when he was 12, and that he'd watched his father become bitter and angry, and he'd promised himself he would never let heartbreak turn him into someone unrecognizable. He said he believed in real love, the kind that lasts forever, the kind where two people choose each other every single day no matter what challenges come their way. I remember thinking that night, sitting across from this incredible man who seemed too good to be true, that maybe I had finally found someone who understood what love really meant. The months that followed were like living in a beautiful dream. Daniel was attentive without being suffocating, romantic without being over the top, supportive without trying to fix everything. He would text me good morning every single day, sometimes with a sweet message, sometimes with a funny meme he knew would make me laugh before my shift started. He remembered the little things, like how I took my coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of almond milk, or how I loved sunflowers more than roses, or how I got anxious in crowded places and needed to hold someone's hand to feel grounded. He met my parents after 2 months of dating, and I watched nervously as my father, who is notoriously difficult to impress and protective of his only daughter, questioned him about his job, his intentions, his life goals. But Daniel handled it perfectly, answering every question with honesty and confidence. And by the end of the evening, even my skeptical father was laughing at his stories and patting him on the back like they'd been friends for years. My mother pulled me aside in the kitchen that night while Daniel and my dad were watching a basketball game in the living room, and she hugged me tight and whispered in my ear that she could see how happy I was, that my eyes lit up when I looked at him, and that she had a good feeling about this one. Hearing those words from my mom, who had always been my voice of reason and wisdom, made me feel like everything was falling into place exactly as it should. We moved in together after 8 months of dating, finding a beautiful 2-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park with exposed brick walls and large windows that flooded the space with natural light. I remember the day we got our keys and walked into our empty apartment, just the two of us, holding hands and imagining how we would make this place our home. Daniel picked me up and spun me around, both of us laughing like teenagers, and then he kissed me softly and said he couldn't wait to wake up next to me every single morning for the rest of his life. We spent weeks furniture shopping, compromising on styles and colors, creating a space that reflected both of our personalities. He insisted on getting a comfortable sectional couch because he said he wanted us to be able to curl up together watching movies on Friday nights. And I insisted on a dining table big enough for dinner parties because I loved cooking for friends and family. Every decision felt like a step toward our future together, toward building something real and lasting. Life with Daniel was comfortable and exciting all at once. We developed our little routines and traditions. Sunday mornings were for sleeping in late and making elaborate breakfasts together, usually pancakes or omelets, while listening to his jazz playlist. Tuesday nights were for trying new recipes, sometimes successfully, sometimes ending in disasters that left us ordering pizza and laughing at our culinary failures. We would go hiking on random Saturday afternoons when the weather was nice, finding trails outside the city where we could escape the noise and just be together in nature. He would take photos of me standing on overlooks, the wind blowing through my hair, and later I would find them saved on his phone with captions like, "My beautiful girl," or "The moment I knew forever was real." He made me feel cherished, valued, seen in ways I had never experienced before. But here's the thing about manipulation, about deception so carefully crafted that you don't see it coming. It hides in the moments of perfection, in the gestures that seem too thoughtful to question, in the love that feels almost too good to be true, because it was too good to be true. Every single moment I just described to you, every sweet text and thoughtful gesture, every declaration of love and every promise of forever, it was all part of a plan. But I didn't know that then. How could I? When you're living inside a love story, when someone is showing you every day that they adore you, when they're meeting your family and planning a future and making you feel like the most important person in their world, why would you question it? Why would you look for cracks in the foundation when everything seems so solid? The proposal came on a snowy December evening, exactly 1 year and 2 months after we first met. Daniel had told me we were going to that same art gallery where we'd met for their anniversary exhibition, and I had dressed up in a burgundy dress that he'd once mentioned he loved seeing me wear. We walked through the gallery hand in hand, reminiscing about that first night, laughing about how nervous we'd both been despite trying to act cool and confident. Then he led me to the back room, the same spot where we'd first locked eyes across the crowd, and when I turned around, he was down on one knee with tears streaming down his face. The ring was absolutely perfect, a simple platinum band with a princess-cut diamond that caught the light in the most beautiful way. He told me I was his everything, his reason for believing in love again, his future, and his home. He said he wanted to spend every remaining day of his life making me as happy as I'd made him this past year. He asked me to marry him, to be his wife, to build a family with him and grow old together. And I said yes through my own tears. Yes, with every fiber of my being. Yes, because I couldn't imagine my life without this man who had become my entire world. My parents were thrilled when we told them the news over dinner the next evening. My mom cried happy tears and immediately started talking about wedding plans, asking me about my dream venue and dress style and flower preferences. My dad shook Daniel's hand firmly and told him he was trusting him with his most precious treasure, and Daniel looked him straight in the eye and promised he would spend his life honoring that trust. My best friend Amanda screamed so loud over the phone when I called her that I had to hold the phone away from my ear, and she immediately started planning my bachelorette party before I'd even thought about setting a date. Everyone in my life was genuinely excited for us, and that validation from the people who knew me best made me even more certain that Daniel was the one. We set the wedding date for August, giving us 8 months to plan. I wanted a summer wedding, something romantic and elegant, but not overly formal. We chose a historic mansion venue just outside the city with beautiful gardens for the ceremony and a grand ballroom for the reception. I spent months planning every detail, agonizing over color schemes and floral arrangements and seating charts. I found my dream wedding dress at the third bridal shop we visited, a stunning A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing train that made me feel like a princess. Amanda and my 2 other bridesmaids, Jessica and Rachel, were with me when I tried it on, and all 3 of them burst into tears the moment I stepped out of the dressing room. The consultant brought out a veil and placed it gently on my head, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, surrounded by my best friends, I felt this overwhelming sense of joy and anticipation for the day I would wear this dress and become Daniel's wife. But something started shifting around the 4-month mark before the wedding. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I convinced myself I was imagining things or being paranoid. Daniel started working late more frequently, coming home at 9 or 10 o'clock instead of his usual 6:30. When I would ask about his day, his answers became shorter, more vague, less detailed than they used to be. He said his firm was handling a major merger and he needed to put in extra hours. And I believed him because that made sense. Because I understood career demands. Because I didn't want to be the nagging fiancé who complained about him working hard. But it wasn't just the late nights. He became distant in other ways too. He stopped asking about my day with the same genuine interest he used to have. Our Sunday morning tradition started fading away because he was too tired or too stressed or had work calls to make. When I tried to discuss wedding details, he seemed disengaged, telling me to make whatever decisions I wanted because he trusted my judgment. But I could see it wasn't about trust. It was about not caring, or not wanting to engage, or something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His phone became an extension of his hand in a way it never had been before. He would check it constantly, even during dinner or while we were watching TV together. When it would buzz with notifications, he would glance at it with this look on his face that I couldn't read, something between anxiety and anticipation. A few times I noticed him quickly switching screens when I walked into the room, and when I asked casually who he was texting, he would say it was just work stuff or his brother checking in. I didn't want to be suspicious. I didn't want to be that person who needed to check their partner's phone or question every explanation. So I pushed down the uneasy feeling growing in my stomach and told myself I was being irrational, that wedding planning stress was making me paranoid, that everything was fine and I was just experiencing cold feet or anxiety about such a big life change. I talked to Amanda about it over coffee one afternoon about 6 weeks before the wedding. I told her about the distance I was feeling, the way Daniel seemed to be pulling away emotionally, even though physically we were still living in the same apartment, sharing the same bed. She asked me if I thought he might be having second thoughts about getting married, and I immediately defended him, saying no, absolutely not, he was just stressed about work and dealing with a lot of pressure. But even as I said those words, even as I tried to convince my best friend and myself that everything was okay, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was wrong, that the man I was planning to marry wasn't the same man who had proposed to me 8 months ago. The changes became more pronounced as the wedding day approached. Daniel stopped initiating physical intimacy, and when I tried to initiate it, he would claim he was exhausted or had an early meeting the next morning. We went from being intimate several times a week to maybe once every 2 weeks, and even then it felt mechanical, like he was going through the motions rather than being present with me. I remembered how passionate we used to be, how he couldn't keep his hands off me in those early months, how he would pull me close randomly throughout the day just to kiss me or hold me. Now he barely touched me unless I initiated it first, and even simple gestures like holding hands while walking or cuddling on the couch became rare. I tried talking to him about it multiple times. I would sit down with him after dinner and gently say that I felt like we were disconnecting, that I was worried about us, that I wanted to make sure we were okay before we got married. Each time, he would give me reassurances that sounded right but felt hollow. He would say he was sorry, that work was consuming him, that once the merger was done, things would go back to normal, that he loved me and couldn't wait to marry me. He would hug me and kiss my forehead and promise to do better, and for maybe 2 or 3 days he would seem more present, more engaged. But then he would slip back into that distant version of himself, the one who lived in our apartment but felt like a stranger. 2 weeks before the wedding, I found him sitting on our couch at 2 in the morning, staring at his phone in the dark. I had gotten up to get water and noticed the living room light was off, but there was a faint glow. When I walked in, he quickly locked his phone and looked startled, like I'd caught him doing something wrong. I asked him what was wrong, why he couldn't sleep, if there was something he needed to talk about. He ran his hands through his hair in this agitated way and said he was fine, just dealing with work stress and insomnia. But his eyes, God, his eyes looked tortured, like he was carrying some enormous weight he couldn't share. I sat down next to him and took his hand, and I begged him to talk to me, to let me in, to tell me what was really going on. For a moment, I thought he might actually open up. His mouth opened like he was about to say something important, something that would explain everything. But then he just shook his head, kissed me on the cheek, and said we should both get some sleep because we had a lot to do in the coming weeks. That was the moment I should have pushed harder. That was the moment I should have demanded answers or called off the wedding until we figured out what was happening. But I didn't. I let him shut me out again because I was scared of what I might discover. Because I had already sent out invitations and confirmed vendors and fitted my dress. Because backing out now would mean admitting that something was fundamentally wrong with us, and I wasn't ready to face that possibility. The week before the wedding was absolute chaos in the best and worst ways. My bridesmaids threw me a beautiful bachelorette party where we drank too much champagne and laughed until our stomachs hurt. My mom and I had lunch together, just the two of us, where she gave me her wedding ring from my grandmother and told me stories about lasting love and commitment. I had my final dress fitting where everything was perfect, every seam and detail exactly right. On the surface, everything was coming together beautifully for what should have been the happiest day of my life. But underneath that surface, I was drowning in anxiety and doubt. Daniel barely spoke to me that entire week. He stayed late at work every single night, and when he came home, he would head straight to bed, claiming exhaustion. We didn't have dinner together once that week. We didn't talk about our upcoming wedding, or our honeymoon, or our future. It was like he was avoiding me, like spending time with his future wife was the last thing he wanted to do. I would lie awake next to him, listening to him breathe, wondering if he was actually asleep or just pretending so he wouldn't have to face me. The night before our wedding, traditionally when couples are supposed to sleep apart, I was relieved rather than sad to spend the night at my parents' house. Amanda, Jessica, and Rachel were there with me, and we stayed up late painting each other's nails and watching romantic comedies and trying to distract me from my nerves. But they could all see something was off. Amanda pulled me aside around midnight and asked me point blank if I was sure I wanted to go through with this, if I was absolutely certain Daniel was the right person. I looked at my best friend, this person who had known me since we were 7 years old, who could read me better than anyone, and I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to say that I was terrified, that the man I was marrying tomorrow didn't feel like the man I'd fallen in love with, that something in my gut was screaming at me to stop. But instead I smiled and said I was just nervous, that all brides feel this way before their wedding day, that everything was perfect and I was being ridiculous for having doubts. She hugged me tight and said she would always be there for me no matter what, and I held on to her thinking that tomorrow everything would change, that once Daniel and I were married, once we'd made that ultimate commitment to each other, things would go back to how they used to be. That night I barely slept, tossing and turning in my childhood bed, staring at my wedding dress hanging on the closet door. Have you ever had one of those nights where your mind won't shut off? Where you replay every moment of a relationship trying to figure out if you missed something crucial? That's what I did for hours, analyzing every conversation and gesture, trying to pinpoint exactly when things had started to change. And the terrifying conclusion I kept coming to, the one I didn't want to acknowledge, was that maybe the perfect beginning had been too perfect, that maybe I'd been so swept up in the romance and attention that I'd ignored warning signs that were there all along, but it was too late to think about that now. In a few hours, I would be walking down the aisle toward Daniel, surrounded by 200 guests who had traveled to celebrate our love. I couldn't call it off based on a feeling, based on anxiety that might just be normal pre-wedding jitters. So I pushed those thoughts away and tried to sleep, telling myself that tomorrow would be beautiful and perfect, and everything I'd dreamed of. The wedding day started exactly how I'd imagined it would. The sun was shining brilliantly, not a cloud in the sky, the temperature perfect for an outdoor ceremony. My bridesmaids and I got to the venue early to start hair and makeup. The suite they'd reserved for us was gorgeous, with huge windows overlooking the gardens where the ceremony would take place. We drank mimosas and laughed as the hairstylist worked her magic on each of us. My mom came in around noon with tears already forming in her eyes, telling me how beautiful I looked, even though I wasn't even in my dress yet. My dad stopped by to say hello, and I could see him trying to hold it together, knowing that in a few hours he would walk his only daughter down the aisle. Everything was proceeding perfectly according to plan. The photographer captured candid moments of us getting ready, all the little details I'd spent months planning. The florist delivered bouquets that exceeded my expectations, absolutely stunning arrangements of white roses and peonies mixed with greenery. When it was finally time to put on my dress, my bridesmaids helped me step into it carefully, buttoning every tiny button up my back. The moment I was fully dressed with my veil in place, standing in front of the mirror, I felt transformed. I looked like a bride, like someone's wife, like I was about to step into the most important moment of my life. My mom burst into full tears when she saw me, hugging me carefully so she wouldn't wrinkle the dress, whispering that she was so proud of the woman I'd become, and so happy I'd found someone to share my life with. Amanda fixed my veil one last time and handed me my bouquet, and then it was time. Time to walk down the aisle. Time to marry Daniel. Time to begin our forever. The ceremony was set to begin at 4 o'clock. At 3:45, my dad and I lined up at the back of the garden, hidden from the guests' view by a beautiful wooden arbor covered in flowers. I could hear the string quartet playing, could see the backs of all our guests seated in white chairs facing the altar where Daniel would be waiting. My hands were shaking as I held onto my dad's arm, and he looked at me with so much love and said he was ready whenever I was. The music changed to the bridal march, and that was our cue. My bridesmaids walked down the aisle one by one in their dusty rose dresses, making their way to the front where Daniel's groomsmen were standing. Then it was my turn. My dad and I stepped into view, and I saw every guest stand up and turn to look at me. I saw my grandmother dabbing her eyes with a tissue, saw friends from college smiling and taking photos, saw coworkers from the hospital where I worked waving gently. And then I saw Daniel standing at the altar in his tuxedo, and my heart stopped. Not in the good way, not in the way it should stop when you see your future husband waiting for you at the end of the aisle. It stopped because of the expression on his face. He looked pale, almost gray, like he might be sick. His jaw was clenched tight, and even from that distance, I could see his hands shaking at his sides. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't looking at me with love or joy or anticipation. He was looking at me like I was walking toward him for an execution rather than a wedding. I kept walking because what else could I do with 200 people watching, and my dad's arm linked through mine. Every step felt heavier than the last, my beautiful dress suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I tried to make eye contact with Daniel, tried to smile at him reassuringly like maybe he was just nervous too, but he kept looking down or away, anywhere but directly at me. The walk down the aisle felt like it took forever and no time at all. When we finally reached the front, my dad kissed my cheek and carefully placed my hand in Daniel's before taking his seat next to my mom in the front row. Daniel's hand was cold and clammy when I took it, and he still wouldn't meet my eyes. The officiant, a kind older man we'd met with several times during our pre-wedding counseling, began speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. His voice seemed to be coming from very far away, like I was underwater and couldn't quite hear him properly. I kept looking at Daniel, silently begging him to look at me, to give me some sign that everything was okay. Finally, he raised his eyes to meet mine, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. It wasn't love. It wasn't nervousness. It was something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Something that looked almost like guilt mixed with resolve, like he'd made a decision he knew would hurt me, but he was going to do it anyway. The officiant had just finished his opening remarks and was about to begin the vows section when Daniel suddenly let go of my hands. The movement was abrupt enough that I actually stumbled slightly, reaching out to steady myself. A murmur went through the crowd, guests sensing that something was wrong. Daniel took a step back from me, then another, putting distance between us. His chest was rising and falling rapidly like he couldn't catch his breath. And then he spoke, and the words that came out of his mouth shattered my entire world into pieces I didn't know could ever be put back together. He said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that he couldn't do this. He said he was sorry, but he couldn't marry me. He said it was over, that he needed to end this now, before it went any further. The gasps from the crowd were immediate and loud, but I barely heard them over the sound of my own heart breaking. I just stood there in my white dress, holding my bouquet, staring at the man I loved as he backed further away from me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare I would wake up from. But it was real. Daniel was really standing there at our wedding altar, in front of everyone we knew and loved, calling off our wedding. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I tried to say his name, but it caught in my throat. Tears started streaming down my face, hot and fast, ruining the makeup that had been so carefully applied hours earlier. I reached out toward him, a desperate gesture asking him to come back, to explain, to tell me this was some kind of terrible mistake. But he just shook his head and took another step back. My dad jumped up from his seat, his face red with anger and confusion, starting to move toward Daniel. My mom was crying loudly, and I could hear Amanda shouting something from where she stood with the other bridesmaids. The officiant looked completely frozen, having no protocol for this situation, no script for what to do when a groom abandons his bride at the altar. And then Daniel did something that somehow made it even worse. He looked directly at me with those eyes I'd gazed into 1,000 times, those eyes I'd seen first thing in the morning and last thing at night for over 2 years, and he said he was sorry for breaking me, that this was necessary, that someday I might understand. Breaking me. Those specific words. Like that had been his intention all along. Like destroying me was the point of everything. Before I could respond, before anyone could stop him, he turned and walked away. He walked right down the center aisle, past all our shocked guests, and disappeared through the garden gate. Just like that, he was gone. And I was left standing at the altar in my wedding dress, abandoned and humiliated in front of everyone I cared about, trying to understand how the love story I'd believed in so completely had just ended in the most brutal way possible. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and confusion. Amanda rushed to my side, wrapping her arms around me as I started to collapse. My legs literally gave out, like my body was physically unable to hold me up anymore under the weight of what had just happened. She held me up while I sobbed uncontrollably, these horrible, gasping sobs that I couldn't control. My mom was there too, crying almost as hard as I was, stroking my hair and saying things I couldn't understand through my own crying. My dad had run after Daniel, but he came back a few minutes later shaking his head, saying Daniel had gotten into a car that was apparently waiting for him and driven off. The guests were all standing now, talking in loud, confused voices, nobody knowing what to do or say. Some people were crying, some were angry, some were just standing there in shock. The bridesmaids and groomsmen looked lost, Daniel's best man trying to apologize to me even though none of this was his fault. Someone needed to make a decision about what to do with 200 confused guests and a reception that had been planned and paid for. My dad, bless him, tried to take control. He stood up and loudly announced that the wedding was obviously not happening and thanked everyone for coming. He said the reception hall was still available and food had been prepared, so guests were welcome to stay and eat if they wanted, or they could leave, whatever made them comfortable. Some people started leaving immediately, probably grateful to escape the awkwardness. Others lingered, coming up to hug me or offer words of sympathy that I couldn't really absorb. I just stood there in my dress, which had cost $3,000 and taken months to find, feeling like a ghost at my own wedding that wasn't. Amanda eventually managed to get me into the bridal suite, with Jessica and Rachel following behind. They carefully removed my veil and started working on the tiny buttons of my dress because I couldn't make my hands cooperate. I sat on the couch in my underwear and strapless bra while they found my regular clothes, and I felt completely numb, like I wasn't really in my body anymore. How do you process something like this? How does your brain make sense of the person you trusted most in the world, publicly destroying you in the most humiliating way imaginable? Amanda helped me get dressed in the jeans and t-shirt I'd brought to change into after the reception. My wedding dress lay in a pile on the floor, this beautiful symbol of a future that no longer existed. Jessica was on the phone trying to cancel the honeymoon flights and hotel reservations. Rachel was dealing with vendors, trying to figure out what could be returned or canceled. And I just sat there staring at nothing, my mind completely blank except for those words Daniel had said. "I'm sorry for breaking you." What did that even mean? Why would breaking me be necessary? None of this made any sense. My parents took me home to their house that night because I couldn't bear the thought of going back to the apartment I shared with Daniel, sleeping in the bed we'd shared, being surrounded by all our things and memories. My mom set me up in my childhood bedroom and brought me tea I didn't drink and tried to get me to eat something I couldn't swallow. My dad paced around the house on his phone, trying to get in touch with Daniel, calling Daniel's brother and friends, trying to get some explanation for what had happened, but Daniel had disappeared completely. His phone went straight to voicemail. His brother claimed he hadn't heard from him and didn't know where he was. His friends all seemed genuinely shocked and said they had no idea why he would do something like this. It was like he'd vanished into thin air immediately after destroying my life. That first night was the longest of my entire existence. I lay in my childhood bed still wearing the makeup I'd had done for my wedding. Mascara and eyeliner streaked down my face from hours of crying, and I stared at the ceiling trying to understand. I replayed every moment of our relationship looking for clues I'd missed, signs that this was coming. The emotional distance in recent months obviously made more sense now, but it still didn't explain why. If he wanted to end things, why go through with planning a wedding? Why wait until we were literally at the altar in front of everyone? Why say those specific words about breaking me being necessary? The humiliation was overwhelming. I kept thinking about all those people who had watched me get abandoned at my own wedding, my co-workers who I'd have to face at the hospital, our mutual friends who were probably all texting each other right now trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed, my extended family who had traveled from different states to be there. Everyone now knew that I'd been left at the altar, that the man who'd promised to love me forever had changed his mind in the most public and painful way possible. How was I supposed to come back from this? How does anyone recover from this level of betrayal and humiliation? The next morning, I forced myself to go back to our apartment because I needed clothes and my work things. Amanda came with me, refusing to let me go alone. When I walked in, everything looked exactly the same as it had 2 days ago, when I'd left to stay at my parents' house before the wedding. The dishes from our last dinner together were still in the sink. His coffee mug was still on the counter. His shoes were by the door. But Daniel wasn't there. His car wasn't in the parking lot. When I checked the bedroom, I noticed that some of his clothes were gone. His work laptop was missing. His toiletries from the bathroom were cleaned out. He'd come back at some point after leaving the wedding and grabbed what he needed, but he hadn't taken everything. Most of his stuff was still here, like he planned to come back eventually. Or like he'd left in such a hurry he'd only grabbed essentials. I stood in our bedroom looking at the bed we'd shared and felt this wave of anger start to replace the numbness. How dare he do this to me and then just disappear without any explanation? How dare he leave me to deal with the aftermath of his decision while he hid like a coward? I deserved answers. I deserved to understand why. I grabbed my phone and called him again, even though I knew it would go to voicemail, and it did. But this time, instead of crying, I left an angry message. I told him he was a coward. I told him he owed me an explanation. I told him he couldn't just destroy someone's life and then vanish without consequences. I was shaking with rage by the time I finished the message, and Amanda had to gently take the phone from my hand because I was about to throw it against the wall. Over the next several days, I went through every emotion possible. Sadness, anger, confusion, despair, numbness, rage, back to sadness. I cried until I couldn't produce any more tears. I screamed into pillows until my throat was raw. I stayed in bed for entire days, unable to find the energy or motivation to do basic things like shower or eat. My mom came over daily with food and clean clothes and love, but even her presence couldn't pull me out of the darkness I'd fallen into. Work called asking when I'd be back, and I had to request a leave of absence because I couldn't imagine facing my coworkers and patients in this state. Amanda practically moved into my parents' house to be with me, sleeping on the floor of my room, forcing me to drink water and take walks around the neighborhood even when I protested. My dad wanted to file some kind of legal action against Daniel. But what would we even sue for? Breach of promise? Emotional distress? No lawsuit would give me back my dignity or erase the memory of standing at that altar while he walked away. About a week after the non-wedding, Daniel's brother Ryan called me. My heart stopped when I saw his name on my phone screen. Ryan and I had always gotten along well, having spent holidays together and double-dated a few times with him and his wife. He said he was calling against Daniel's wishes, that Daniel had made him promise not to contact me, but Ryan felt I deserved some kind of explanation, even if it wasn't the full truth. He said Daniel had checked into a hotel and was apparently dealing with some kind of personal crisis he wouldn't fully explain. He said Daniel had told him he'd done what he had to do, that it was better this way, that I would move on and be fine eventually. Better this way? Better to be publicly humiliated and abandoned? Better to have my heart ripped out in front of 200 people? I asked Ryan if Daniel had been cheating on me, if there was another woman, because at least that would make some kind of sense. But Ryan said no. As far as he knew, there was no one else. That Daniel had been acting strange for months, but it wasn't about another relationship. I asked him what it was about then, but Ryan said he honestly didn't know, that Daniel wasn't giving him real answers either. The conversation left me more frustrated than before because it confirmed that Daniel's behavior was intentional and planned, but gave me no insight into why. Have you ever been left with questions that haunt you every waking moment? Questions that consume you because without answers you can't move forward or find closure? 2 weeks after the wedding that wasn't, I finally forced myself to return to work. I couldn't hide at my parents' house forever, and financially I needed my job. Walking back into the hospital was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, could hear the whispers that stopped when I walked past, could sense the pity from my co-workers even when they tried to act normal. My supervisor pulled me aside and said everyone was glad to have me back, and if I needed anything or needed to talk, her door was always open. I appreciated the kindness, but I just wanted to do my job and not think about my personal life falling apart. Working with my young patients actually helped more than I expected. Being present for them and their families, focusing on their needs instead of my own pain, gave me a sense of purpose I desperately needed. There's something about caring for sick children that puts your own problems in perspective, not in a way that makes them disappear, but in a way that reminds you that suffering comes in many forms, and we all find ways to keep going. But every time I had a break or went home at the end of my shift, the questions came flooding back. Why did Daniel do this? What did he mean about breaking me being necessary? Where was he now, and what was he doing? I tried to move forward with my life in practical ways. I found a new apartment and started the process of moving out of the place Daniel and I had shared. I couldn't afford it on my own anyway, and living there with all those memories was torture. Amanda, Jessica, and Rachel helped me pack up my things over a weekend, and we left all of Daniel's stuff exactly where it was. If he wanted it, he could come get it himself. I changed my relationship status on social media and deleted every photo of us together because seeing his face made me physically ill. I threw away anything he'd given me as gifts, unable to bear looking at items that had once represented his love, but now only represented his betrayal. My mom kept asking if I wanted to talk to a therapist, and finally I agreed because clearly trying to process this on my own wasn't working. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Chen, specialized in trauma and grief. In our first session, when I told her what had happened, I saw a flicker of shock cross her face before she composed herself into professional sympathy. She told me what I'd experienced was a form of psychological trauma, that being abandoned at your wedding in front of a large audience could have effects similar to PTSD. She said the lack of closure and explanation was compounding the trauma because my brain couldn't make sense of what happened, couldn't create a narrative that allowed for healing. Over several sessions, she helped me start to process my feelings and develop coping mechanisms, but even she couldn't answer the questions that kept me up at night about why Daniel had done this. About a month after the non-wedding, something strange happened that should have been my first clue that there was more to this story than a simple case of cold feet or changed heart. I was at the grocery store doing my weekly shopping when I ran into Sarah Mitchell, Daniel's coworker from his financial firm. We'd met several times at company events and had always been friendly. When she saw me, her face went through several expressions very quickly. Surprise, discomfort, something that almost looked like fear. She started to turn away like she was going to pretend she hadn't seen me, but I called out her name because I was desperate for any information about Daniel or what was going on with him. She reluctantly came over, and I could see she was extremely uncomfortable. I asked her if she'd seen Daniel at work, if he was okay, if she knew anything about why he'd done what he did. She got very quiet and kept looking around like she was afraid someone might overhear us. Then she said something that made no sense at all. She said she couldn't talk to me about Daniel, that she'd been told not to, that it was complicated, and she could lose her job if she said anything. I asked her what she meant by that, why discussing Daniel could cost her job, but she just shook her head and hurried away, practically running from me. I stood there in the produce section completely confused. Why would Daniel's coworkers be instructed not to talk to me? What could possibly be so complicated that mentioning him could result in job loss? This wasn't normal breakup behavior. This was something else entirely, something deliberate and organized. That interaction stayed with me, bothering me like a splinter I couldn't remove. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that there was information being deliberately kept from me. Daniel hadn't just impulsively decided to leave me at the altar. This was planned, coordinated, part of something bigger that I wasn't seeing. But what? And why? I started paying more attention to small details I'd previously overlooked. I remembered those late nights Daniel had been working before the wedding, and how vague he'd been about the merger his firm was supposedly handling. I remembered how protective he'd become of his phone, how he'd changed his passcode at some point without mentioning it to me. I remembered a few times I'd answered his phone when he was in the shower, and the person on the other end had immediately hung up when they heard my voice instead of his. At the time, I'd dismissed these things as stress or coincidence, but now they felt like pieces of a puzzle I needed to solve. I decided I needed to do some investigating of my own. I knew Daniel's passwords for most things because we'd shared them before, believing we had nothing to hide from each other. I logged into our shared laptop, the one we'd both used for personal stuff, and started going through his files and browsing history. At first, I didn't find anything unusual. Normal work documents, emails about wedding planning from months ago, saved articles about hiking trails and recipes. But then I found a folder buried deep in his documents labeled Projects 2023, which seemed innocuous enough. But when I opened it, The files inside had names that made no sense. Phase 1, timeline adjustments, contingency plans, final steps. I opened the first file and found a document that made my blood run cold. It was dated from 6 months before our wedding, right around the time I'd first noticed Daniel becoming distant. The document was written like a project plan or strategy outline, and it detailed steps and timelines and goals, but it wasn't about any work project. It was about me, about us, about our relationship. I sat there reading this document, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The document referred to me by name throughout, describing me in clinical detached terms like I was a subject in an experiment rather than the woman he supposedly loved. It talked about maintaining engagement and ensuring emotional investment, and timing the dissolution for maximum impact. There were notes about how I'd become sufficiently attached and how the foundation had been properly established. It referenced the target date, which corresponded exactly to our wedding date. This wasn't a journal or random notes. This was a detailed plan for how to manipulate me, make me fall deeply in love, and then destroy me in the most public and painful way possible. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to do something so calculated and cruel? I kept reading, clicking through more files, finding more documents that filled in pieces of the horrifying picture. There were notes about our early dates, about how he'd researched what kind of man I would fall for based on my past relationships and social media posts. There were observations about my vulnerabilities, my fears, my insecurities, all documented like some kind of psychological profile. There was a file labeled Key Strategies that outlined how he'd deliberately love-bombed me in the beginning to create intense attachment, how he'd integrated himself into my family and friend group to make the eventual betrayal more devastating, how he'd insisted on a large wedding with many guests to ensure maximum humiliation. I was going to be sick. I ran to the bathroom and threw up, my body physically rejecting what my mind was trying to process. This wasn't a relationship that had gone wrong. This wasn't a man who'd gotten cold feet or fallen out of love. This was a deliberate, methodical, calculated plan to emotionally destroy me, and he'd executed it perfectly. I'd been played from the very beginning, from that first night at the art gallery when I'd thought we had some magical connection. It had all been fake. Every moment, every word, every gesture of love. He'd been following a script designed to break me. But I still didn't understand why. What had I done to deserve this? Who creates an elaborate 2-year plan to psychologically torture someone? I went back to the laptop, desperate for more answers, and finally found a file labeled Contract and Compensation. When I opened it, I saw something that made absolutely no sense at first. It was a legal contract between Daniel Thompson and someone named Marcus Winters, dated 3 years ago, before Daniel and I had even met. The contract outlined terms and conditions for some kind of social experiment, involving targeted relationship manipulation and psychological impact assessment. There were payment terms, confidentiality clauses, and specific deliverables Daniel was expected to achieve. The payment amount made my eyes bulge. $500,000 to be paid in installments as certain milestones were reached, with the final payment due upon successful completion of project dissolution. Someone had paid Daniel $500,000 to enter into a fake relationship with me and destroy me. This wasn't personal. This wasn't revenge for something I'd done. I was a paid project, an assignment, a target in someone's twisted social experiment. But who was Marcus Winters? Why would anyone pay that much money to have someone psychologically torture me? What was the purpose? I searched for Marcus Winters online and found several people with that name, but one stood out. Marcus Winters, a wealthy entrepreneur and amateur psychologist who'd made his fortune in tech and apparently spent his time conducting what he called social dynamics research. His website talked about studying human behavior, attachment theory, and trauma responses. He had published several controversial papers about emotional manipulation and the lasting effects of betrayal, and apparently I had been his latest research subject without my knowledge or consent. The more I read about Marcus Winters, the more horrified I became. He had a history of conducting what he called field experiments that ethically minded researchers would call psychological abuse. He'd been investigated multiple times for his methods, but nothing had ever stuck because he had expensive lawyers, and his subjects rarely knew they'd been experimented on. He believed that studying real human responses to authentic betrayal and trauma provided valuable data that couldn't be obtained through traditional ethical research methods. In other words, he was a sociopath with money who thought his curiosity justified destroying people's lives, and Daniel had been his paid accomplice. Daniel had agreed to spend 2 years pretending to love me, making me trust him completely, integrating into every aspect of my life, proposing marriage, and then abandoning me at the altar, all so Marcus Winters could observe and document my emotional breakdown. This was the plan. This was what Daniel had meant when he said breaking me was necessary. It wasn't about me or anything I'd done. It was about money and some sick research project. I'd been nothing but data to them, a specimen to be studied, my pain and humiliation just interesting variables in their experiment. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurry with tears of fury. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. These people had stolen 2 years of my life, had manipulated my emotions and relationships, had humiliated me in front of everyone I loved, had caused trauma that would take years to heal from, all for money and curiosity. And they thought they could get away with it because who would believe such an elaborate, insane scheme? I immediately called the police and told them I needed to report something. But when the officers came to take my statement and I showed them the documents I'd found, they seemed skeptical. Yes, what Daniel and Marcus had done was unethical and horrible, but was it technically illegal? They'd have to consult with legal experts and prosecutors. The contract I'd found could potentially be considered fraud or intentional infliction of emotional distress, but these were civil matters, not criminal ones. They couldn't just arrest Daniel and Marcus without building a case. They told me I should contact a lawyer who specialized in civil litigation. I hung up feeling frustrated and helpless, but I wasn't giving up. I contacted 3 different lawyers over the next week, and finally found one who believed me and was willing to take my case. Attorney Jennifer Marsh specialized in unusual psychological abuse cases and had successfully sued a cult leader for similar manipulative practices. When I showed her all the documents I'd found, her eyes widened and she said this was one of the most egregious cases she'd seen. The evidence was solid, the contract was real, and we had a strong case for fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and potentially conspiracy. She said we could go after both Daniel and Marcus Winters for damages. And given Marcus's wealth, we could potentially get a substantial settlement. But more importantly, we could expose what they'd done and make sure they faced consequences for treating human beings like lab rats. Jennifer filed the lawsuit within 2 weeks. We sued for $2 million in damages plus legal fees, and we included detailed descriptions of the psychological manipulation and trauma I'd experienced. We attached the documents I'd found as evidence, and we made sure to file it publicly so media outlets could access the court documents. I wanted everyone to know what these men had done. I wanted Daniel's name attached to this forever. I wanted Marcus Winters' reputation destroyed the way mine had been. The lawsuit made local news within days, and then it went viral on social media. People were absolutely horrified and outraged. My story was shared thousands of times with comments expressing disgust at Daniel and Marcus, sympathy for what I'd been through, and admiration for my courage in fighting back. Journalists started reaching out wanting to interview me. True crime podcasters wanted to cover my story. A documentary filmmaker contacted me about potentially creating a film about psychological manipulation and consent in research. Suddenly, instead of being the humiliated woman who got left at the altar, I became the brave survivor who exposed a twisted social experiment and fought back against her abusers. Daniel and Marcus both hired expensive legal teams who tried to get the case dismissed, claiming the contract was fake or that I'd misinterpreted it. But Jennifer was relentless, deposing witnesses, subpoenaing financial records, building an airtight case. She found bank statements showing Marcus had paid Daniel exactly the amount specified in the contract at exactly the milestones mentioned. She found emails between Daniel and Marcus discussing my progress and emotional state, like I was a project to be managed. She found recordings Marcus had made of conversations with Daniel, where they discussed strategy and timing. Every piece of evidence made their guilt more undeniable. The case took 8 months to work through the legal system. During that time, I had to relive the trauma over and over as I gave depositions and prepared testimony. I had to face Daniel in court and look at the man I'd once loved while knowing everything had been a lie. He couldn't even meet my eyes most of the time. And when he did, I saw shame there, which was at least something. Marcus Winters, on the other hand, showed no remorse whatsoever. He actually tried to argue in court that his research was valuable and that my consent wasn't necessary because studying authentic responses required subjects to be unaware they were being studied. His own lawyer looked disgusted by that argument. In the end, we won. The judge ruled in my favor on all counts and awarded me $1.8 million in damages. More importantly, the judge issued a scathing statement about the ethical violations and psychological abuse involved in the case, calling what Daniel and Marcus had done reprehensible and cruel beyond measure. Daniel was ordered to pay his portion immediately, essentially bankrupting him and destroying his career in finance. Marcus Winters, who could afford the payment, was also ordered to shut down any ongoing research projects and was banned from conducting any more experiments involving unwitting human subjects. The verdict made national news, setting a precedent for cases involving psychological manipulation and consent. But honestly, the money didn't matter as much as the validation. Having a judge officially declare that what had been done to me was wrong, that my pain was real, and my anger was justified, that these men were guilty and should face consequences, that meant everything. It gave me closure in a way I'd never thought possible. Daniel tried to reach out to me after the verdict, sending a letter through his lawyer expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness. I read it once and then burned it. He didn't deserve my forgiveness. He'd made his choice when he accepted that contract, when he looked me in the eyes for 2 years while lying about every feeling, when he walked away from me at that altar knowing the devastation he was causing. His regret now, whether genuine or performative, didn't change what he'd done or the scars he'd left. I used the settlement money to pay off my student loans, buy a small house, and donate a substantial amount to organizations that support survivors of psychological abuse and manipulation. I also started speaking publicly about my experience, partnering with psychologists and ethicists to educate people about coercive control and emotional abuse. My story became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a rallying cry for better protections against these kinds of psychological crimes. And slowly, painfully, I started to heal. The therapy continued, helping me process the complex layers of trauma and betrayal. Dr. Chen helped me understand that nothing Daniel had done was my fault, that I hadn't been stupid or naive to fall for his manipulation, that he'd been skilled and intentional, and I'd responded exactly the way any emotionally healthy person would to someone who appeared to love them. The fact that it was all fake didn't mean my feelings weren't real, or that I should feel ashamed for having trusted him. I had to grieve the relationship and the future I'd envisioned, even though I now knew it had never really existed. That grief was complicated and messy because how do you mourn something that wasn't real? But Dr. Chen explained that my experience of the relationship had been real, my feelings had been real, my investment and dreams had been real, even if Daniel's had been manufactured. So I let myself grieve for the woman I'd been before all this happened, for the innocent belief in love I'd had, for the future with children and a partner that had been stolen from me. I also had to work through my ability to trust again. The betrayal had made me suspicious of everyone's motives, hypervigilant for signs of deception, unable to take anyone's words or actions at face value. I pushed away friends who tried to get close, assuming they had ulterior motives. I rejected romantic interest from good men, convinced they were all potentially hiding dark intentions. Learning to open my heart again, to be vulnerable, to trust that most people are genuine even though some aren't. That was perhaps the hardest part of recovery. It took over a year before I could even consider dating again, and even then it was terrifying. But you know what? I survived. Against all odds, despite the calculated cruelty designed specifically to break me, I survived and actually became stronger. The experience taught me things about resilience and inner strength that I'd never have learned otherwise. It taught me that I could endure unimaginable pain and come out the other side still standing. It taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness even when someone exploits it, that loving fully isn't foolish even when someone takes advantage of it, that trusting isn't naive even when someone betrays it. Those are choices I made because they reflect who I am, and I refuse to let what Daniel and Marcus did change my fundamental nature into something bitter and closed off. I also learned to recognize my own worth independent of anyone else's validation. For so long, I'd measured my value through Daniel's eyes, through his approval and affection. When he withdrew those things, I felt worthless. But through recovery, I learned that my worth was inherent, not something someone else could give or take away. I was valuable because I was kind and competent and compassionate and strong. I was valuable because I cared about people and did meaningful work and had close relationships with family and friends who genuinely loved me. Daniel's manipulation and betrayal couldn't actually diminish my worth. It could only make me temporarily forget it. Relearning that truth was transformative. About 2 years after the non-wedding, something beautiful happened. I met someone. His name was James, and he was an emergency room physician at a different hospital. We met at a medical conference where I was speaking on a panel about trauma-informed care for pediatric patients. He approached me after my talk to tell me how insightful he'd found my perspective, and we ended up talking for hours about medicine and life and experiences that had shaped us. When he asked for my number, I felt that familiar flutter of fear and excitement, but this time I chose courage over self-protection. We dated slowly, carefully, with me being upfront from the beginning about my history and my need to take things at a measured pace. James was patient and understanding in ways that felt genuine, and over time I learned to trust him. Not naively or blindly, but with eyes wide open, with healthy boundaries and communication, with the wisdom that came from my painful education about manipulation and red flags. He met my family and friends. He integrated into my life naturally rather than forcing it. He respected my pace and my healing process. And eventually, after a year of dating, when he told me he loved me, I believed him. Not because I was incapable of imagining he might be lying, but because I'd learned to read authentic emotion, to trust my instincts while also staying grounded in reality, to believe in love while also protecting myself. 3 years after that terrible wedding day, James proposed to me during a quiet weekend camping trip, just the two of us under the stars. There was no audience, no pressure, just genuine feeling and a question asked with hope and vulnerability. And I said yes, this time with full confidence and joy, with no nagging doubts or red flags I was ignoring. We got married 6 months later in a tiny ceremony with just immediate family and closest friends, exactly the opposite of the spectacle my first wedding attempt had been. It was intimate and real and perfect, and when I walked toward James and saw the love in his eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that this was real, that he was choosing me for the right reasons, that our future together was built on solid ground. Standing there making vows that actually meant something to both of us, I felt this profound sense of triumph. Daniel and Marcus had tried to break me, had designed an elaborate scheme specifically to destroy my ability to trust and love, but they'd failed. I was standing at an altar again, this time with a man who genuinely loved me, proving that their cruelty hadn't won, that I was stronger than they'd anticipated, that love was possible even after betrayal. Sometimes people ask me if I hate Daniel or Marcus, if I fantasize about revenge, if I'm still angry about what they did. The truth is more complicated than a simple yes or no. I think what they did was unconscionable, and they deserved every legal consequence they faced. I think they exhibited sociopathic behavior that caused real harm and trauma. But hate is exhausting, and I refuse to give them any more of my energy than they've already taken. I don't forgive them exactly, but I also don't let them occupy space in my thoughts the way they once did. They're part of my history now, a painful chapter that's closed, a story I tell to help others rather than one that defines me. I also want to say something to anyone watching this who has experienced betrayal or manipulation or psychological abuse. I see you. I believe you. What happened to you was real, and your pain is valid, and you didn't deserve it no matter what anyone says. The person who hurt you made choices that reflected their character, not your worth. And I need you to know that you can survive this, even when it feels impossible. Even when the pain is so overwhelming you can't imagine ever feeling normal again. You have strength inside you that you probably don't realize yet. Reserves of resilience that will carry you through this if you let them. Get help, get therapy, get support from people who love you, but also believe in your own capacity to heal and grow and eventually thrive again. Your story doesn't end with the betrayal. That's just the middle chapter, the dark part before the transformation and redemption. You get to write what comes next, and trust me, you can make it beautiful. So let me ask you, have you ever experienced a betrayal that shook your entire world? Have you ever had to rebuild your life from scratch after someone you trusted destroyed it? If you have, I want you to know you're not alone. Share your story in the comments if you feel comfortable, because community and connection are powerful tools for healing. And if my story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or made you feel less alone or helped you understand your own experience better, please hit that like button. Your engagement helps this video reach more people who might need to hear this message. Make sure you subscribe to I Live to Tell for more real stories from real people who have survived unimaginable challenges and come out stronger on the other side. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might change your perspective or give you the courage to face your own challenges. Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to survive and thrive in a complicated world, and sharing our stories, learning from each other's experiences, that's how we do it together. Thank you for listening to my story, for bearing witness to my pain and my triumph, for being part of this community that believes in resilience and healing and the power of truth. Remember, you are stronger than you think, more resilient than you know, and capable of surviving things you never imagined you could endure. Whatever you're facing right now, you can get through it. I'm living proof.